So, Mike, before we start sharing screens and walking through this new version, our membership is constantly growing, and I think there's a fair to middling chance that for a lot of our members, this might be the first framework that they've sort of come across and encountered. So, with that in mind, can you briefly explain the origins of the framework and perhaps what it's looking to achieve?
Yeah, I mean, the framework has been in existence since the organisation started when it was the IISP, because to judge someone's professional capability, it's based on knowledge, experience, and competence. And that has to be evidence because anybody could say, I'm a security professional, but there was nothing to actually judge people against to say, well, how do you prove that you are professional in that particular domain? But over a number of years, the profession has changed. There's a lot more interest and a lot more involvement in information security and cybersecurity than there was when IISP was started. And the framework, everyone has to give evidence against it to become a member. Now, like everything else, experience has said that sometimes trying to provide evidence against the framework has been a challenge because no one size fits all. Some people are more specialist in some areas and some people are more wide ranging in their experience and contribution. And sometimes the way of applying meant that it was a bit difficult to sort of look for something to say, well, how can I evidence that? Because I have to evidence right across the piece. So we have made some changes to what you need to do to apply using the framework. But we also took the opportunity to enhance it to be more inclusive in some other sectors that are now involved in security considerably. And also, as we know, the world has changed. One of the things we can't do is be specific about systems and specific about devices because they're forever changing. If we put the word BlackBerry in, that was very, de rigueur many years ago, but now there aren't really any BlackBerry devices, and they've moved on to provide other types of services. Likewise, if you started talking about Samsung or Android or Apple. So we've tried to avoid that, and we've tried to make it more about the problem and the issues as opposed to the actual technical devices and technical systems. But what we have done is try to widen some of that wording so that people can go, oh yeah, that does apply to me, and yes, that does apply to me. And I'll go into that a bit more when we talk through the framework.
Okay, Bill. So just following on from that, who would you say the framework is aimed at? Well, obviously individuals and organizations, but can you be more specific?
Well, to some extent, as you answered it yourself there, it's not something that you have to work for a big organization to be able to demonstrate you're professional, because there are a lot of people who are self-employed as consultants. There are some people who work for companies that don't have many employees but still have to look at security to obviously satisfy their customers and also look after their data. So it's effectively, it doesn't matter how large the organisation or where you sit in the organisation, if you've got an involvement in security, the framework is aimed that you will be able to map your skills in your context of what you do to be able to show that you're professional in the area that you work. As opposed to being very specific and saying this is about someone who does penetration testing, or this is someone who works in a SOC, and it only is written for those people. The framework is intended to try and be largely agnostic and inclusive. So it doesn't matter where you work, because as most of the people listening in on this will know, you will have a job title, but if you compared what you did with your job title to your next door neighbour, you might have the same job title, but there'll be a few subtle differences, not including pay, but there'll be other things about numbers of staff you're responsible for, what you actually do, where you sit in an organisation. So it's very difficult to make one size fits all. But what we've tried to do is make it wide enough that you can sit there no matter where you work and say, yes, I can evidence my skills against the skills framework to demonstrate my professionalism.
Real. And before we go into the sort of screen sharing part of the webinar, CIISec, we've got a few frameworks that make up our capability methodology. My understanding is that the roles framework is the next one under review, but how does this skills framework sort of integrate and complement all these other frameworks?
Well, what the Institute has got is it started off with its skills framework, and then it added a couple of other frameworks as well. You mentioned the roles framework, and there is also a knowledge framework. The idea behind the roles framework, which is something I was heavily involved in, is that lots of people don't really know from their role what sort of skills they would need to evidence, either for career progression or even how to demonstrate to their own internal HR departments that, I'm a professional, and you may have people who work in accounting and people work in HR and people who work in other recognised professional areas, but often security wasn't necessarily recognised as a profession, which we all know it is. And so the role framework started to give some generic typical roles which exist, and then started to map what that typical role would do against the skills framework to make it a bit easier for people to say, if I'm a CISO or if I'm work in a secure operating centre, what sort of skills would I probably need in that role, and then map that against the skills framework. But to say, as the skills framework's undergone quite a considerable change, I'm now looking to expand the number of roles in there, and also upgrade it against other particular frameworks out there, because internationally there's the NICE framework, and as part of NIST, and there are some other elements as well that we're looking to sort of incorporate. One of the other things that the role framework would include is a sort of a duties library, because one of the things that people will say is, I work as a CISO, but my duties will be perhaps different to someone else's duties. But again, there'll be probably some typical duties that most people do. So we're trying to map the role to the type of duties you perform, and then the skills that will be associated to evidence your competency to achieve that.
Well, should we do a screen share, Mike? You happy to have a go? We're in the hands of
technology. We'll have a go and
here.
See if it works, because like most things, technology doesn't always work, but we'll have a go.
This was the bit that was keeping me up last night.
Right. Hopefully. Right.
All good.
That's come up.
Yeah.
Right. So I'm not going to go through it exactly page by page, because most of you now would have downloaded it. But if we want to go into basically the introduction, which is on page 3, with any framework, there'll be a lot of people saying, well, how do I use it? What do I do? There is a link on this page, the guidance for accredited membership. And that guidance sets out what you need to do to achieve the appropriate level, whether it's an associate or a full member, and what you have to evidence against using the framework. I won't click on the link now, but for those of you who have done that already, it does set out what the requirements are, because this framework has introduced the notion of mandatory skills, also essential skills and specialism skills. So after a lot of discussion over the years, nearly everyone said it's no good being very, very good at your role if you haven't got the ability to communicate your skills either high up to board level or right through the organisation to the coalface. And often some of the criticisms in the past of security have been that people talk in a different language and the board switch off, or the staff don't really understand why they have to do things. So we've included the soft skills, J1, J2 and J3, as mandatory. So you've got to give evidence of how you are competent to actually communicate your knowledge and skills and expertise to those who need to be communicated with. The other mandatory skill is CPD, continual professional development. You would all received an email, hopefully by now, that says you must now annually submit CPD to show that you're continually managing and improving and updating yourself in relation to your profession. So that is now a mandated skill that you have to show that. And there will be, I think there's already been links going out, but there's also advice going out in relation to the new CPD form, which Marie from the Secretariat is now heading up CPD. And I know, because I've been involved in it, working on the new, more interactive form that you can complete your CPD evidence. We then go into a section of essential skills. Now, these skills although some people say, what's the difference between mandatory and essential? Well, mandatory, everyone has to do. But essential, there are 5 essential skills that are listed. And when we go through the framework, I'll talk about those. But not everyone can say that they're actively involved in some of those essential skills. So you have the option that when you do submit your evidence, you have to pick 3 from the 5 of them, because some people will have more leaning in their particular role to some of the essential skills than something else. One of the criticisms of the old framework is that you had to sort of evidence against virtually everything, which is difficult if you actually specialise in a certain area. And then the final element of your evidence for compliance against the framework is you can then pick the other skills that are relevant to your role to provide probably the bulk of your evidence. Because some people, if you work, for example, and I'll talk about that, we've introduced a lot more law enforcement and investigative capability. If your role is in digital investigations, it's very difficult perhaps for you to evidence some of the other competencies, but you can actually provide an awful lot of evidence in relation to that. Likewise, if you're a SOC analyst, again, what we're trying to do now is give you the opportunity, if you are more focused in one area of cyber and information security, to do that through the framework. Doesn't, of course, stop people who actually provide a wider range of skills to actually evidence across the piece, but we've given the opportunity for you to choose which is the most appropriate. So what I'll do now is just start to go through the areas. Hopefully, Dom, does that come up?
Yep, that's all good.
Right. So as we said before, some of the mandatory skills, we'll cover those in a minute, but some of the essential skills we've got is A2, for example, policy and standards. It says on the right-hand side is essential. If you're working, you need to understand what the policy and standards are applicable to your role. And policy and standards can vary widely between organisations. Some of the policy and standards relates to the legal and regulatory environment that you work in. So again, those two, A2 and A6, are considered as essential skills for you to be able to evidence if that's where you're working. And again, we didn't list, and when we go further into the framework, we've listed a couple of examples of sorts of regulatory elements and policies and standards like the BSI and ISO standards, but we haven't listed them all because we can't include everyone. So if you look in the main framework and you see a particular ISO standard as exampled, it doesn't mean if it's you work to another standard, if it's not listed, it doesn't apply. We're just trying to signpost the examples of the type of standards that might apply for you to supply your evidence. Now, going through it, we have had some changes. If you look at B5 under skill area B, we've included a new skill of data analysis. There's a lot more emphasis on people, whether you're doing risk management or risk assessment, or you're working in an environment where you actually are faced with a lot of data relating to security, whether it's output from alerts or output from firewalls or output from all sorts of systems, including incident reporting, whatever, that there's actually quite a skill, an element of skill in being able to understand what's important and what's not important. And some people who are actually now employed by organisations, their main focus is on security data analysis. So going back to my earlier comment, there are some people who in the past would have to try and evidence a number of different skill areas, but it didn't necessarily cover where they worked. So if you're working in a SOC or you're working in incident management, data analysis is an area where you can now start submitting some of your evidence. So one of the other areas that we have introduced considerable change is in some of the wording in the framework. I won't go too much into the details of it, but some examples we've included where in the past we were talking, for say, leadership. We're often referring to people who are leaders, but often many of you are subject matter experts. So you were providing advice to a board, but you weren't there as a leader within your organisation. You may have been brought in to provide your subject matter expertise. So we've included in the wording, wherever we refer to leadership, that SME capability. Equally, one of the things you may have noticed, we've introduced the word cyber. Now, we held back from that for a while because, like everything else, suddenly everything was cyber. And of course, now most of you know everything now is AI. But cyber as a word has become embedded. So we've added cyber and information security throughout the framework. We've also introduced elements that reflect on the wider merging of physical security and to some extent personnel security. So we've related to things like access control. Beforehand, when we were talking about measurements and intrusion detection, people often thought it was all technical, but a lot more physical controls rely on technology, whether it's CCTV, access control systems, swipe cards. They all now have a technical element with a physical security part to it. So we've changed some of the words that if you're working in an environment which is physical security, which also uses a lot of technology, and I know from my past when I was working, we had some people who were physical security as a name, but they had an awful lot of involvement with technology to support that physical security. So those people can now actually involve and evidence their particular skills. We've also gone into including, flicked it through, investigation and securing evidence. There should be, I think, some law enforcement people on the call today. One of the drivers for the change and updating of the framework is that there was a separate profession, the Institute of Cyber Digital Investigators profession, which started about 5 years ago. That has now been incorporated into CIISec. But as you know, an awful lot of incidents that occur now require the ability to preserve evidence, still continue your business, can do digital investigations, and if necessary, taking it through to a court or to a tribunal. So law enforcement merging into CIISec has also driven the need to change the framework to include a lot of their skills, but also a lot of the skills are also in whether you work in perhaps finance and you're doing some investigations into perhaps some corruption, which are internal. You can actually still evidence against them whether you're working in law enforcement or investigations in general. That's
Mike,
sort of,
yeah. Sorry, I was just going.
That's what I was just going to say. So that's a sort of a brief element to it.
What was the decision-making process in terms of deciding which skills areas were essential and or mandatory? Was that just the collaboration through the framework development?
To some extent, yes. I mean, one of the drivers to the change was, as I said before, there was a case of you had to evidence against the framework, but it wasn't steering you into which bits that you expect the majority of people to be able to evidence that I mentioned before, communications and professional development. There are some other areas which are everyone, to some extent, most people evidenced against it anyway, but we were trying to give the ability for people to focus more on special areas where they work rather than having to do the wide-ranging application. So it sort of shook down from those discussions.
Yeah.
So I think that probably covers quite a lot of the sort of the major changes and the fact that how you apply for it has changed as well. It's probably looking at the time now. I mean, are you happy to start some Q&A, or do you think there's anything else that might need to be covered? Because I could go on forever going through the framework, but that might, it could be like watching paint dry for some people if they've already read it, and there might be more burning questions coming out from the audience. So
did you want to just go through the next page, because that talks about the different levels as well, doesn't it?
I will do that, yes. I mean, at the end of the day, when you have a skill, there will be some people who would say, well, I'm an expert in a particular area, and so you're talking about level 5 or 6. The actual skill summary gives you more of a definition where you would claim your skill area. But some people, I mean, for example, you may well be a head of security, but you don't know exactly how your firewall works. You have experts who help you with that. So you might only have a level 2 or 3 knowledge of some of the deep technology, but you're expected to have an understanding of how it fits in. So when you're making risk-based decisions, you understand the context of some of the things that are being discussed and put in front of you to help make your decision. Obviously, there are some people who operate at a very high level, but not all CISOs are experts in everything. Again, they would rely on some of their team at lower levels to give them advice and guidance. but you still need to have an understanding. So when you're providing your evidence against the framework, you might say, I'm quite good at perhaps architecture, but I'm not level 6, level 5 or level 4. But in my evidence, I might put some evidence to show I'm level 3 in relation to that. So it doesn't mean everyone has to be an expert or everyone has to have a very slim knowledge. You can, in the context of your environment and your role, use the skills framework to evidence against the particular skills you've chosen at the appropriate level.
Is it worth just quickly going through and just showing one of those skill set areas actually?
Yeah.
Just as an example, yeah.
I mean, if we give the example, first of all, A is mainly about governance and management. We've said before, policies and standards. You will have the skills group, policy and standards A2. The principles are bullet pointed there. And then on the right-hand side are example skills for the appropriate level. And this is the thing we're trying to say. It doesn't mean you have to evidence, say, level 4 exactly what it says there. They're example skills. You know in your role where you can fit your competence and capability into a sort of submission and application for membership. But to some extent, you know how you're doing it in the context of your environment. And the idea of this is to give you a steer towards which level might be appropriate for the particular skill you're evidencing. If we go, and I say earlier about examples, ISO 27000 and 17025 and the security policy framework are examples of policies and standards, but they're not the end list. We could have pages and pages of all the different policies and standards that exist out there. So we've given a few examples. If we talk into third-party management, a lot of people now focus on how good are their third parties in supporting them, because most organizations have a third party element to the support that is provided to them. So I was involved in it. I know a number of other people are involved in how do you manage your third parties. So again, there's a skill area here that people can evidence some of their work they undertake of how they manage, review and check the abilities of their third party suppliers. If I go into perhaps security architecture, again, not everyone will be fully experienced, but we've now added things like SCADA and OT and other types of security architectures that have a security element to them, because in the past the framework was more focused on networks. But as we know now, there are a considerable number of security related systems or systems that have security implications that are a normal part day-to-day sort of business controls or technical controls or robotics or controlling water systems or in the power systems that wouldn't necessarily be classed as a network, but would be actually an architecture, but in its broader sense. So we try to include that so that people, for example, in the nuclear industry, an awful lot of their security concerns and management requirements are focused on sort of industrial control systems. So we've added the word, but it doesn't mean that that's the be all and end all, because in some organizations they will call it something different. I think let's find another. Trying to find intrusion detection, and again, if you're in intrusion and detection analysis, it gives again what the principles are and the skill levels associated with it. You could go on forever through some of those. Incident management and incident response, we've expanded that again because a lot of organizations now are more focused on identifying incidents before they occur as opposed to having to respond afterwards. So we've enlarged some of the principles in relation to what would be expected from some evidence and example skills according to the levels. And that's how it progresses. So there's a high level term, forensics, there's the principles, and then the example skills that you would look at and say, if I'm heavily involved in digital forensics, I can actually provide a lot of examples under that particular skills group to be able to achieve membership. And then this is, again, digital investigation. It's not all about law enforcement, but law enforcement is heavily involved in digital investigation. But I know a lot of organisations have their own investigations where there's been a complaint perhaps by a member of staff of someone else's activity. Now it's not a case of did someone say something to someone in a room? It's a case of was someone in that room? Has someone sent messages? Have they used social media? So organisations' internal investigations have had a far greater digital element to it, and so the framework has been amended to reflect that. The other ones which we've included, again, is like digital, is that data protection and privacy. Again, considerable involvement now that if organisations fail or have an incident where they're reported to the Information Commissioner, the sort of privacy and data protection element often look at what was in place from a security point of view to make sure that individuals' data was protected. So again, we've slightly enhanced the skills group to reflect that. Again, business continuity, if you go through it compared with the old framework, there's been some slightly updating of the wording and also some sort of reflection of the way businesses are working. It's not all about prevention, it's resilience. In other words, something will happen. So how do you manage it when it does, and how resilient are you in relation to post-incident? It's not a case of something's gone wrong, turn everything off. How does the organisation work? How does it plan? How does it mitigate it? Again, people who work in incident investigation or business continuity, that also has a security element to it. And then going into the research side of it, a lot of people actually do research but don't necessarily attribute the fact that they've done some research. And research can also be you found out a better way of doing something and then sharing that capability across an organisation or actually across sectors. I know some examples where people have found a problem, shared how they've dealt with it. So they've actually put some research into a particular problem or a vulnerability, then applied that research, shared it to enable other people to perhaps mitigate against a particular problem. And then the last one, which is one of the mandatory ones, is management, leadership and influence and business skills. As we said, is no good you being very good at your job if you cannot articulate it and communicate it, whether verbally or written or other means, to the people who that advice is meant to be received by, because otherwise it's misinterpreted or not acted upon. That's why we consider this one of the mandatory skills. And lastly, that J3 was the mandatory communication and knowledge sharing. If you know something good, it's no good just saying, well, I keep it to myself. Our profession relies on everyone understanding where a problem is, sharing when something's happened, and also saying what's the best way of trying to get across it and improve in the future. So it's one of those key areas.
Yeah.
And then the last one is contributions to the community. There are a lot of people listening on here who will either voluntarily go into schools or will actually try and encourage their sort of people who work in security to actually make it less of a mysterious world and actually take it outside. You often see people preparing articles for local papers. I've seen that. There have been people who say not only schools, but also in business areas. Some people will actually go into local business forums to actually explain and demystify some things that happen in security. So that's a brief run through.
Yeah.
If that helps, I'll unshare.
That was brilliant, Mike. Before we go to Q&A, and I can see there's lots of questions been coming in, and hopefully a lot of the team have been answering those as well. Often skills frameworks, these sort of workforce competency style documents, they're great pieces of work, but often they can be sort of filed away, forgotten about, sort of tick box exercise. What sort of advice can you give to individuals, organizations that want to integrate this framework into their, into their people development practices or into their individual career goals? What advice could you give?
Well, I do know there are some organisations that have adopted the skills framework as their benchmark and methods of assessing how their staff not only operate, but also assisting in identifying what is needed for continual professional development, whether it's courses, etc. but it can be equally used for an individual. You don't have to work in a large organization. What we've tried to do is identify the key areas, which are not just all technical. There are soft skills as well as technical skills that will make for a rounded and focused security individual. So its use can be either as a case of some people just want to show that they do know what they're doing and they can be trusted as a professional, and they will go through the route of being accredited. So when they are either employed by an organisation, it's a method of demonstrating they are competent and capable, or where they're providing advice and guidance in the form of consultancy, that they can show that they have been assessed and accredited as being a professional in that area. So it's part of the approach that CIISec has been taking, is to demonstrate that someone who is a member of our institute has been assessed through a recognised framework, through a rigorous assessment, and that's peer assessment, that can demonstrate to someone in the outside world that they do know what they're talking about. Because, if you take the doctor analogy, you can't just say, I think I'll be a doctor today, and then just turn up and, start dispensing. You have to have the basic knowledge, but you can also be an expert. But the sort of medical council and the sort of profession of doctors has been going for a couple of 100 years, and it's taken a long time for them to be able to assess and set their frameworks up. Our institute, and actually information security and cybersecurity, is relatively a new kid on the block. So one of the things that we've been trying to do is make it relevant without trying to make it too specific. And one thing I would like to add is that whereas in the past it's taken a while perhaps to update the framework, we're now committed to an annual review of the framework, because once this hits the ground and is used, there will no doubt be some issues identified through practical use. And so those changes will be noted and taken aboard for any particular review. So whether it's version 3.1 next year, it will take on board either changes in practice or changes in terminology that have to be included, but also if there's other areas that perhaps have been left out that could be included.
Well, you stole away my last question, because I was going to ask you, what do you anticipate for a version 3.1 or 4.0? I guess it's just wait and see how the industry reacts to it, and that will happen once they start applying it.
Yeah, I think that's the case. I mean, there'll be people out there going, I've read through the framework and it hasn't mentioned this, or I've read through the framework and that's a bit unclear. We appreciate that. When you're trying to do something that hits across the piece, we could spend forever trying to get it right and never get it published. So the view was there had been a need to change it. There had been a couple of other important areas in law enforcement, and also, for example, the nuclear industry are very keen to use this, and they put in some comments in relation to its its old format, and where it needed to perhaps wider reflect some of their activity. And no doubt, as the end of this, there'll be people saying there could be a bit more focus on this or a bit more focus on that, and that's when we'll be taking that on board and looking to adapt it.
Yeah. Like I said, there's a few questions that have been coming in. Samuel, thank you. Regarding the roles framework review, would you know when the next update is due? Be next year?
Well, basically, I'm starting to work on that now. Because the roles framework is heavily linked to the skills framework, until the skills framework had been finalised and approved, I couldn't really start work on the roles framework. But one thing that I will be looking for the wider community is examples of roles. Now, if you look at the existing roles framework, there's only about a dozen roles on there. Now, as we've added a few other elements to the skills framework, including analysts, I'll be looking to add some more typical roles to it as examples. So again, if anyone, when they look at the roles framework, feels that there's some roles that are actually now becoming more widespread that can be included in there, please again drop the Secretariat a line, and that can be included in the changes. But I'm hoping to have something within the next 3 months that will be able to be, put out for publication.
Okay. Matthew, has asked, is there a mapping of the skills level within the CIISec Skills Framework to the information age levels, SFIA?
Now, the person who can answer that is probably Kevin, who is not on the call today, but the Sophia element, it has been mapped against it, I can tell you that, but I'm not the expert on that aspect of it. Okay. But that can be, someone from the team can probably, confirm that element has been mapped, because we've been using the Sophia elements for our skills levels, and that's been something that we did review when we were doing the review of the framework. But I'm not an expert on that, so I'm not going to make a sweeping statement, but that will be something that one of the CIISec members who is involved in that can confirm.
Well, Matthew, we'll come back to you on that one. With confirmation. Just scrolling through now, and I can see Danny's been doing a fabulous job responding to a lot of the questions. Oh, Megan's asked, if you do not have the experience through your career in all the skill sets, whatever evidence can you provide to portray, that you can obtain to portray your skill set and knowledge? Would a training course be accepted as evidence, for example?
There are some training courses that are accepted as evidence. In the guidance, you'll see a list of some of those for the associate level that can be used as sort of evidence of your capability, because especially those that are certificated. I haven't got the list in front of me, but there is a list of courses. Like everything else, that goes back to the levels. There might be something that you've just started in an environment in security, and you wouldn't necessarily be a level 4, 5 and 6, but you can also join the institute at one of the lower levels and then gradually progress through as you can actually provide evidence at the higher levels.
Right, okay. Sarah's asked, will former ICDIP members still be assessed by former ICDIP members, as the skills framework should be assessed by those you know how to apply legal and law enforcement knowledge and skills?
Yeah, the answer to that is yes. And the current accreditation committee, I co-chair the CIISec Accreditation Committee, but I was also the co-chair of the ICDIP Accreditation Committee. And what we are incorporating is there are members of the ICDIP Accreditation Committee will be sitting with the CIISec Accreditation Committee going forward, because we're just going through the last stragglers of those who've applied under the old ICDIP framework. And then once that's closed off, then going forward, new law enforcement applicants will use this skills framework, but they will still be assessed by people who understand that particular sector. And when it comes to the formal accreditation committee, there will be former ICDIP members who sat on their accreditation committee sitting on the enlarged CIISec one. Yeah. So I can assure you that is one of the key concerns, that it wasn't a case of incorporating a different professional body, changing the wording of the skills framework, and then not being assessed by someone who doesn't understand where you're coming from. A lot of work went into the skills framework to look at the law enforcement element, and there was a lot of backwards and forwards with different groups about what needed to be included. And on the whole, I think most people found that it was probably easier to evidence this framework than it was under the old one, which had about 340 odd different skills and different job families. So this is more encompassing to allow people to focus where they actually work in law enforcement, as we said, the specialism area, but equally some of the things I said earlier about essential and mandatory, they all apply to everybody. So
Paul's asked, well, we kind of covered part of Paul's question, but he has asked, is there a reason that we've excluded level 7 from our framework when it was aligned with the Sophia?
That I can't answer myself, because I take it from say Kevin was the framework expert from our side, so I wish I could give you an answer, but I don't know. So I'll just but that can be something that can be put to Kevin to come back to you.
Cool. Some very nice complimentary comments about the framework as well. But I think we've addressed all the comments and questions, hopefully. Like I said, if there's any that we haven't come across, we'll take those offline and respond to you individually. Just to add that the framework's up on the resources area of the CIISec website, but it was also emailed out to all members as well. If you're a current CIISec member and you haven't received a copy, please get in touch with membership and we will send you a version. There's 2 versions available. There's a standard PDF and there's an interactive version as well. I think the other thing to say is perhaps watch this space. And if you're a corporate member of CIISec, we are looking at how we can turn this framework into a sort of data recording tool that can sort of map and chart individuals against the skills area. So that's something that we're certainly looking at the moment. Mike, thank you ever so much for your time and all the work on the framework and just spending the 40 odd minutes just to talk through it. Much appreciated.
That's right. I mean, I think at the end of this is the test of it will be its use, because, like as I said earlier, we've tried to make it more widely sort of agnostic and inclusive. I think is the main thing we're saying. But also and addressing perhaps the concern from the law enforcement side is that some people who work in a specific area, you will notice when you read through that framework, it has included a lot more about evidence and investigations and following certain things that were included in the old framework from it that are now included in the new one. But equally, there are a lot of people who are perhaps new to security who will now hopefully recognise that they are able to supply evidence where perhaps under the old framework, they might have found it harder to evidence across a wider piece.
So, Mike, again, thank you ever so much. Thank you, everybody, for joining this webinar this morning. Like I said, the recording will be up on the website in the coming days, and wish you a rest of a very good day. Thank you very much. Goodbye.